You are listening to the Intrepid radio program with Scotty Roberts. Intelligent Talk.
Well, happy Friday evening, folks. It's the end of Christmas week, and that's nice. All we've got is New Year's coming up now next week, and then we move into the long haul until spring, especially if you're up here in the Great White North, waiting for the really newly started winter to come to an end. And, of course, this is Scotty Roberts. I'm your host here on the Intrepid radio program, right here on the Odyssey Radio Network. And you can go over to odysy1.com to Odyssey Radio Network and see all the goodness that is Odyssey Radio. You can check out their schedule of events and see all the different places online and terrestrial stations where this show plays. And you can also come over to my YouTube channel to get the visual, the video simulcast of this show. And you can join the other Intrepeds in the chat room for live during the show. And by the way, since I mentioned this to somebody earlier today, if you come into the chat room during the show, it's live. If you go back to any of the archived shows and listen to them and watch them, you will see the chat room. You just won't be able to add anything to the chat because it will be the replay of the chat. And but there are comments in the videos, and also all the different places where this show plays through Odyssey Radio in archive. You can catch it on iTunes, on Spreaker, on all the other places that I can't think of off the top of my head. iHeartRadio is a place to find it, and several other outlets. So go take a look over at odysy1.com. And welcome to the show tonight. Thanks for being here. Thanks for coming in on a Friday night. You know, I would tend to think that I don't get most young people who are out usually clubbing or doing other things, partying and other stuff on a Friday evening. So this is more for the, I suppose the people who like to stay at home or have kids or have other things going on, or they've kind of moved beyond in that developmental spiral dynamic, beyond the need to go partying every Friday night. And it's like I've contended for many years now. I could party just like I did when I was 20 years old. It just hurts more now. And so I don't do quite as much of that. And, you know, the same goes for drinking. I love a good scotch. I love a good Guinness stout. I have my beers of choice that I like, such as Newcastle Brown Ale, or what's the other one? It's got the bicycle. A Fat Tire. I like that one. But again, I'm not a notorious drinker anymore. I don't do it. It's affectatious these days. You know, the view of the intellectual writer who likes to sit at his typewriter with a dim lamp and a cigarette burning in the ashtray and a bottle of bourbon to take a shot every now and then. Because Hemingway said, you know, write drunk, but edit sober. So, you know, there's that romantic affectatious view that I don't even engage in that anymore. And this came up in a conversation with somebody yesterday, with Brother Michael. Those of you who know Michael R. in the chat room, he and I were talking about this stuff, and I said, you know, I just don't drink anymore. I have maybe a drink of something, a shot of scotch or a Guinness every 6 weeks or so. I just don't have the opportunity. I'm a dad. I'm a parent. I'm homebound. I don't go out drinking with the boys. About the closest I've come is that I will do a show right after this one tonight with Jim Johnson, J.V. Johnson. He was the owner of Taps Para magazine when I was the editor-in-chief there. And he and I used to drink together a bit. And so now we do a little Friday night thing that it's generally every Friday. We're trying to make it. But we've only done 2 shows so far where we do a little drinking and a little open-ended musing about things on air. And so that's through his YouTube channel, and you can go find that. And so that's about it. That's all I do anymore, as far as Friday night fare or Saturday night partying and things like that. So you're probably much the same way. If you're here, you're probably a lot like that. So let's move on to what we want to talk about today. And I got this big series going that's been going for weeks now on paganism and Christianity and Christo-paganism and how those things come together, and why, asking the question, why do you believe what you say you believe? And looking into a lot of this stuff. And I'm not going to get back into that tonight, although what I'm going to talk about tonight might fit neatly into that category and some of the things we've already talked about. And even tonight's program isn't going to be an exhaustive look at this. I want to talk about magic and Christianity. And, I've heard over the years phrases from people that say, or sentences and paragraphs, ideas, come from people that say, Christianity is full of pagan magic. And, it is when you start to look at it. Take the very simplest thing in Christianity, prayer. Prayer is magical incantation, put in different clothes for Christianity and worship. And so these things exist out there, and I just want us to take some basic, simplistic looks at this stuff today. Pardon me. My whole household has been sick this week. Now I've had a chronic cough for like 20 years. Just dry throat and stuff like that. So it's been going on since I was a kid. So hopefully that doesn't mean dire problems when I become elderly, which I'm not, by the way. I might have some white hair, a lot of white hair, white beard, which you now see growing out over the last week. But by no means am I elderly. When your chest hair starts turning white, like mine, and I'm not a very hairy person, so my chest hair, I get that little tuft there, and when it turns white, my wife likes to make me shave it off. And even my own mother, who is 78 years old, said to me not long ago, she said, "You need to shave your white beard. It makes me look old." So, I'm just beyond middle age now, and so those things happen. And maybe that ties into the first part that we were talking about not going out and partying like we used to when we were kids. That's because we got kids. We got things going on. But I don't even know how I rabbit trailed onto that, but let me get back onto the topic of things I've heard over the years have said that Christianity is filled with pagan magic. And I talked about prayer being one of those things that we do. That is Christian incantation. And I like to study magic. I've only really started launching into researching magic per se, isolating it out from other things within Christian belief. Because I wanted to see what it was. And it's not just because I love Harry Potter. But the reasons are very complicated. They're complicated as they are personal. Why I like to study and I like to know about these things and research them. And it's good to address these things. And again, the bulk of this could take weeks and numerous books to study and go through. So I want to hit some highlights. And the first thing I want to say is that I hope none of you think that I take personal glee in or perverse desire of some kind in exposing inconsistencies in ancient Christian religion and in ancient Christian piety. When I talk about Christianity being as early Christianity, as we've talked about many times over the last several weeks, early Christianity was not the Christianity you know today in modern churches. It was very different. And it wasn't until the 300s that you started seeing Orthodox Christianity taking over or winning the war, if you will, between Orthodoxy and the mystery religions in which Christianity was founded. And there were certain belief systems in place, but things like even the deity of Jesus Christ was not an issue in the early church. And so there were many practices that held over from the Gnostic mysticism, which actually permeated the Mediterranean world at the time of Jesus and the time just after his death, the couple of centuries right after. And it was a slow evolution, but it was the hierarchy in the Orthodox Church, which is not the Catholic Church, Roman Catholic like you know it. It was the Eastern Orthodox Church, and it rose out of Coptic Christianity, which sprang up in Egypt from the Gnostics. And so all of this mystery religion stuff, do I take glee in pointing out that the Christianity I once believed in so strongly, and that maybe some of you believe in, or at least were raised in, and are familiar with, I don't like poking holes in it for the sake of poking holes. I have seen some people that would take this stuff that I talk about, and I've seen it in many areas where they've chosen to believe differently than their parents' Presbyterianism or their Baptist church upbringing or their Catholicism that they came out of. And they like to mock these old religions, which I'm not trying to do. These old denominations, these old practices. I don't want to mock it. So I'm not here to poke holes in it. If this is what you choose to believe, that is your heart matter. If you want to believe the things you believe about Christianity or paganism or anything else, that's your choice. I'm not here to dissuade you. But what I'm doing is presenting you to the things that I have studied and researched that find that it's really difficult, unless somebody comes up with something that I haven't seen and I haven't looked at, it's really difficult to put my faith in the spirituality of Christianity anymore when I've learned the history of it and how it got to be what it is now. If God, very God, came down, sacrificed his only begotten Son in Christianity with salvific purposes, then I would think that message wouldn't have taken 300 years to evolve at the time of early Christianity. It would have been immediate, and it was there. So I don't take great glee in poking for the inconsistencies in early Christian piety. And I have to look at it and say that somehow early Christianity's reliance on love spells, Jesus amulets, curse tablets, all of that invalidates their legitimacy as moral actors in history. And so why? You might be a critic of that. You might be a skeptic of that and say, why? Why would that invalidate it? Would Christians whose own religion denounces magic rely on bizarre, disgusting, and often shamefully misogynistic strategies to navigate their daily lives? No. So as important as it is to recognize how ancient and modern Christians differ, castigating the ancient smacks of this desperate axe grinding from a recovering fundamentalist or a reformed Catholic. And we want to mock these things and rather than look at the serious scholarship that brought those things to the way they are now. And not only is it unproductive, but that breaks a cardinal rule of historians, and that's foisting modern morality onto ancient sensibilities. Can't do that. You can't look at stuff that we look at in antiquity and expect that they thought of things the same way we do now. They had their own way of viewing the world, and in early Christianity, that view was based in Gnostic mysticism, which had held over from centuries before the time of Christ. And so it's unproductive. There's a scholar, a biblical scholar, Robert Orsi, and he said that religious studies is not a moralizing discipline. So I refrain from condoning, defending, or passing judgment on our subject matter in favor of exploring how religious functions in specific geographical and chronological contexts took place. So you have to look at these things through that light. So I sometimes it's fun to poke a little fun. I get that. Comedy is what drives us away from insanity, I think. I remember sitting when I was writing some of my books and some of the stuff where I really started seeing the inconsistencies in history when it came to the things that I believed by faith in the Christian church. And I remember sitting there thinking, God is either much bigger than we thought he was or much, much smaller than we thought he was. And I remember writing at the time, these are the things that drove people insane, trying to comprehend them. And so if you can remove yourself from the box and look back in, we don't apply our modern sensibilities onto ancient sensibilities. It doesn't work. They thought differently. They saw things contextually very differently than we do now. And so this doesn't relegate religious studies to a mere knowledge production, so to speak. In my own work, my own studies, my own research, I strive to highlight the relevancy of research, even as arcane as ancient Christian magic, and how through studying the rituals and the habits of ancient Christians, we can promote empathy, exercise humility, tear down walls of misunderstanding in the present. And so my first and probably most important reason for studying ancient Christian magic, getting a grasp on what this is that it explores the 99% of antiquity, not the 1%. And so church history brings to mind big names like Ignatius and Tertullian and John Chrysostom, Chrysostom, I think it's pronounced, the emphasis thing. Augustine, Jerome, and some of these guys. These are the names that come to mind when you study church history. And introductory classes on these things often focus on the major events like Constantine's victory at the Milvian Bridge, or social changes like the rise of monotheism and monasticism. But the church fathers, the bishops, the monks, the emperors, they all constitute this bulk of research in the field that I study, but they ironically reflect the vast minority of the ancient Christian population, the 1%, if you will. And so they are the 1%, by the way, the ancient hierarchy of the Orthodox Church. But they're the ones who won the war of words. They won the war of scholarship at the time. And so they made these things into what they wanted them to be. Much like we talked about Mary Magdalene last night. She wasn't a whore, but that's what the church made her to be. They needed her to be that in order to knock her down several pegs as a teacher. She couldn't be a teacher because that's not what the church hierarchy taught. So the major heroes of Christianity were, in general, wealthy politicians. They were statesmen, men, not women. They were statesmen. They were lawyers. They were scholars. And I'm talking about the Orthodox hierarchy. And their own prestige afforded them this certain level of fame to their writings, even during their own lifetimes. And it enabled them to be copied over and over again to our present age. And archaeology, likewise, favors the 1%, as the massive basilicas tend to survive 15 centuries, far better than mud brick houses in the Mediterranean countryside. And so you see, everything is kind of skewed to the side that won the argument in the day. And so this isn't because of any latent bias in academia. This is simply the nature of the evidence in a field that's so removed from its subject. However, focusing on the 1% of ancient Christianity skews our understanding of how the 99% of Christians thought, how they worshipped, how they related to each other, and the divine, and the way they related to the divine in antiquity, a different mindset than we have now. And so getting to the core of what the common folk thought and how they believed, especially when you had the Orthodox hierarchy set about on a systematic campaign to destroy all the writings of the Gnostic mystics, of the old mysticisms, the mystic schools, how they persecuted the people who believed those things. And they ended up where they were in about the late 3rd, early 4th century. So the late 200s, the early 300s, in really coasting into what has become the foundations for modern Christianity. And so it's really difficult to describe how, looking at those characters who wrote these things, performed these deeds of persecution, of wiping out the other side of thought in order to save their own as the only way to think religiously and faith-wise. It's really hard to describe them without talking about how privileged they were. And by privilege, please don't confuse that with me latching that onto what is nowadays with political correctness called privileged. It has nothing to do with that. It's not what I'm talking about at all. So barely 15 to 20% of the population in antiquity had any level of literacy. Living in a lot of these guys who wrote the things that are the basis for modern Christianity lived in villas fit for kings. They had time to wax eloquent on the nature of the Trinity that others spent on subsistence farming. Life for the masses, in the words of Thomas Hobbes, was poor, nasty, brutish, and short. And so they didn't have time to think about these things or to write them down. They just practiced what they believed. And archaeology reveals to us a world that's characterized by high birth mortality rate, rampant parasites, near complete lack of public health initiatives. And so it's within that world that we have to imagine early Christian magic. Studying magic more than any theological texts brings us face to face with the average ancient Christian and how they practiced their faith on the ground. So they were like the Fred Flintstone mobiles of their day. It's where the flesh of the bottom of the foot hit the road. And so it's kind of interesting when you do something like, say, focusing your camera on an apotropaic menorah described in the threshold of an ancient house in Pence. The power that the symbol held for the original homeowner is almost as palpable. You're looking at these things, you're seeing them. And when I study curse tablets found in situ, which archaeological term, in situ, in the ground, where you found them without them being moved from their original discovery, when you study them in situ, you encounter the angst and the anxiety of the last person who touched that object. So I know I was at, I can't say lots about this, but I was at Gebel el Silsila, my friend John Ward's archaeological site in Egypt. And in the Roman portion of their site there, dating back to Tiberius Caesar, we found little braids of hair that were human hair from 2,000 years plus ago that were all wrapped up and they were tossed in a corner of a room. And you find this as you're lifting the silt and the dirt off of the foundations of that room, and there's this twisted knot of hair that's braided. It was a spell. And here it is in Roman-occupied Egypt in the early Christian era. So you see that, and you know somebody had purpose and intent when they took that braid of hair and put it in that corner. So there's an immediacy to ancient ritual that is far, far removed from the rarefied rhetoric of, say, even Paul the Apostle or Pausanias. And so, in short, everyone practiced magic in antiquity, but not everyone, in fact, very few, wrote sweeping theological tracts or eloquent sermons about it. So focusing on the former is my way of exploring the nature of ancient Christianity, and it's a field that's so dominated by the big-name event histories and historians that we miss what the common folk did. And we're going to get into that a little more after the break. So I'm running long on this segment for the radio, and so we're going to go ahead and cut out to break. Folks, stay tuned for a few minutes, and we'll be right back. All right, folks, welcome back from that break. This is Scotty Roberts. Thanks for tuning in. This is the Intrepid radio program right here on the Odyssey Radio Network, which is at odysy1.com for the audio radio version of this show. And all the outlets are listed over there where you can pick this show up audibly. Or you can also come over to my YouTube channel and watch the video right here over with the live chat room and the Intrepids, that family that joins us every night over there. And watch this show at youtube.com/Mr. Scotty Roberts. I want to welcome you all here tonight, and all of those of you who are new over on the chat room as well. And so let's just pick this up where we left off, because I have far too much material to cover tonight. Because it's stuff that I think is important to understanding religion, to understanding Christianity better, as we start to look at it comparatively, and whether or not it can blend with paganism. Is there a blend? Is there a way, as we've talked about for weeks now, going through that spiral dynamic scale from infancy up to going beyond to global and almost avatar, the mythic avatar stance of looking back down through the funnel? And so I'm not going to explain that all right now again. It would take the whole rest of the show. Suffice it to say, if you haven't seen those episodes, you can go back and catch those, and you can see what we're talking about. But I want to go into a next step in looking at this Christian magic, and looking at Jesus as the great physician, or the magical civic defender. And out of all the hats that Jesus wore, all these vocational things he did in the New Testament, carpenter, stonemason. By the way, the word used for carpenter in the Koine Greek in the New Testament is the same word for stonemason. And we know that there are places where Joseph and his adopted son Jesus would have worked as men around Nazareth. And Sepharim, I think was the name of the city. as one of the places, and they would have been carpenters and stonemasons, general contractors. So Jesus, he was a carpenter, he was a stonemason, a general contractor, he was a rabbi, he was a physician. Although not a doctor, he was a physician. He was an exorcist. You start putting those all together, and then you find that now he's also a civic protector. Is that a new one for you? So plenty of the Greco-Roman cities had patron deities. Athens had Athena, Ephesus had Artemis. But where did Jesus fit into this role as this polytheism declined in the late antiquity period? A little-known artifact from Philippi suggests that late antique Christians or late antiquity Christians came to view Jesus as exactly this, an anti-demon civic protector, by the 6th century CE or AD in the Common Era, so almost 600 years after his life. And so about a century ago, archaeologists discovered 2 marble blocks that formally adorned the city gates of the city of Philippi. And inscribed on these blocks, in compact form, the Byzantine script was apocryphal correspondence between King Abgar and Jesus, 600 years after his death. And this is described by Eusebius in his Ecclesiastica Historia. And of course, Eusebius, being that main church writer under Constantine. So Abgar, who is wasting away from a disease, petitions Jesus to visit Edessa and heal him. Of course, Jesus has been dead for a long time. He lauds Jesus' fame and expresses vaguely anti-Semitic pity that the Jews are mistreating him, offering Edessa as a place of refuge if Jesus so desires to leave Jerusalem. And in a short response, Jesus sends his regrets, and apparently being too busy with his whole crucifixion thing to trouble himself with a trip to Edessa. So what would impel the Philippians to inscribe these words on their wall? Judging by the epigraphy on the professional hand, its prominent position overlooking the city's main thoroughfare, the inscription certainly isn't graffiti. Instead, it's a wealthy patron apparently saw this as an effective defense weapon against potential enemies. I got to put up my praise of Jesus. Am I asking him to come and give healing to our city and all of this? And I'm going to put up the fictional Jesus response to it 600 years after his lifetime. And so later copies of this correspondence, including the Philippian inscription, have a protective blessing added to the end of Jesus' letter back. And it says, "Your city shall be blessed, and no enemy shall ever be master of it." And so Eusebius' version says, Eusebius' version, which the scholars assume is the earliest attestation of this document, completely lacks this addendum. But that's what appeared on the wall, on the marble slabs. Now, because of this addendum, Jesus and King Abgar, that correspondence, apparently gained transaction as a magical strategy in late antiquity. And keep in mind, it's completely fictional, because it took place in the 6th century, so 500 years after the time of Christ. And not only have archaeologists discovered similar artifacts in Ephesus, Euclida, Edessa, but a few magical books in antiquity invoke the Abgar correspondence as a potent spell. And what better way to harness and channel ritual power than Jesus' own written words, when they weren't really his words at all? So I have to suggest that the Philippian inscription demonstrates how late antique Christians appropriated an existing tradition and invested it with a new meaning, essentially rebranding Jesus as a magical civic defender rather than just the great physician. And so the purpose of this study is to illustrate that religious traditions have a life cycle that are not created in a cultural vacuum. The symbolic function and value of stories changes as individuals and communities adopt them for their own specific needs. In the case of Philippi, they apparently felt a whole hell of a lot safer with the words of Christ carved into their city gates. And, of course, once again, for emphasis, those weren't the real words of Jesus. So there's all kinds of things that we can look at, and I have to look at my time because I have so much information pulled up in front of me here that I want to get across to you. I could talk about how magic and miracles spread Christianity in its early years, and that'll take us well beyond the end of this program. I could talk about, all these things like, let's say cursing your neighbor, and Corinthian magic in the early Christian church. I could look at a Coptic magical Christmas. It was almost like a Christmas card that was sent out way back in the 400s that showed depictions of angels and depictions of Jesus, but it was all wrapped up in little magical spells on a papyrus that was folded into a cube, and it gave the same incantations and messages on every side. You could look at religion in the magical papyrus of Christianity and magic. They come together. I actually pulled images for that, but I didn't prep them yet to be able to show you, so they're just sitting open in my Photoshop, and I didn't do anything with them. Excuse me, I got this cough again. So let's take a quick look for the rest of the show of how magic and miracles spread Christianity. With this you will conquer. That's what Emperor Constantine said. And take note, he defeated his enemy Licinius and established Christianity as the focal religion of the Roman Empire and changed history forever. That's all pretty spectacular stuff. It's also incredibly misleading. Constantine, the first Christian emperor? Christianized, but he was not Christian in the definition of Christian, and he was about as vile an emperor as they came, who took his last rites and baptism on his deathbed in order to save himself from going to hell. So it wasn't emperors who made Christianity. It was the ordinary men and women who were under their rule. It wasn't governors and generals who opposed Christianity. It was ordinary men and women who opposed it. And so the story of ordinary people, their engagement with the supernatural through magic and miracles, makes sense of the origins of Christianity. Because in the ancient world, the cares and concerns of such people, either pro or against, are mundane. How will I survive? They ask. Can I do more? Can I flourish? The hazards of life, illness, accident, personal confrontations. Is it possible to control these things? My family, my ancestors, my offspring. How can I honor, protect, and strengthen them? These were the questions of the common folk. And the responses to these questions rested on the belief in supernatural powers of all sorts surrounding and penetrating every aspect of the common person's life. There was no meaning, no problem solving, no hope, no society unless these powers were recognized, mollified, and persuaded to do good, or at the least to do no harm. And so facing the new religion of Christianity, a polytheist's world of many powers suddenly collapsed into a world of one almighty and mightily jealous God by the 300s. And this God was capable of great good and also of great harm. This was a literally tectonic reordering of the polytheist bedrock beliefs in magic and the supernatural. For some Jews, a fulfillment of Yahweh's plan through a Messiah meant the collapse of a world based on the Mosaic law and the temple priests and sacrifices, and its replacement by a self-reliant network of associations that were preparing for the end of the world. The new Christianity. Why would any ordinary polytheist or Jew at that time voluntarily dispense with the received way of dealing with the supernatural and trade it in for a new model, all based on this country rabbi who was crucified for blasphemy? And so by about 150 AD, you're looking at a good 120 years after the death of Jesus, 4 generations after the crucifixion, all the eyewitnesses, all the ordinary folk were dead. The new Jesus sect, also called the Way, capital W, the Way, had begun to be interpreted, spread, and controlled by an elite within the movement. And these men, closely tied intellectually and culturally to the polytheistic culture around them, were mostly concerned with touting Christianity using categories of thoughts and actions familiar to educated Romans and Greeks. This orthodox, literally straight thinking is the definition of that, elite conceived pictured, elated ordinary men and women in important ways. And so retrieving the early Christians and Christianity, largely unseen by the Orthodox version of the beginnings, essentially writing about the invisible Christians, is hard because ordinary people are usually voiceless in the material that survives them from antiquity. And it's doubly hard because discussions of early Christianity are usually written in the most indelible ink of elite discourse, as we already talked about in the first segment. The elites wrote the history, the hierarchy of the Orthodox Church. And both ancient and modern times have these. But by critically using Latin and Greek literary materials, Jewish sources, the New Testament writings of the early church, and comparative studies of non-ancient societies, it's possible to unveil those near invisible souls, those people who have no voice in history because they were the common sweat-driven, Walmart shopping Christians of ancient antiquity. And comparative studies of these non-ancient societies it brings us to a place where it's possible to unveil those near-invisible people, both polytheistic and Jewish, and understand how they all interacted in a world seeing the advent of a new way. The Way, the followers of Jesus, a way that would eventually produce a sign under which Constantine would change the world. And it was all driven by the common folk. But you have to trace the experience of ordinary Jewish men and women and their expectations about Yahweh's conventional relationship with them, and most specifically about a charismatic leader, a Messiah, who they believed would come to reestablish them in their proper place of success as God's children and destroy their worldly enemies. Yahweh's failure to live up to his end of that covenant to protect the Jewish people became more and more urgent, especially at the time of Jesus under Roman domination. And Rome wiped them out by 70 AD, some 30 to 40 years after the death of Jesus. And so in proclaiming Jesus to be that Messiah, Christianity offered this solution to this long-burning frustration within the Jewish experience, which had come to its forefront at least since the Maccabean revolt against the Greek overlords in the mid-2nd century BC, and more immediately since the Roman conquest in Judea in 67 BC. And the early Christian proselytizers had to convince the Jews that Jesus provided that resolution. But he didn't provide it the way they wanted. Remember when we talked about Palm Sunday? Hosanna to the King, and the masses were shouting, "Hail to the King," as Jesus rode in on a white donkey into the city of Jerusalem. Well, what they were doing was they were imitating the Maccabean family of about a century earlier that removed the Greeks from the temple in Jerusalem. And the symbol of the Maccabean family was the palm frond. And so these people, when they saw Jesus riding in, and his 3 years of acclaim up to that point, he was going to be the divine king that was the Messiah, the kinsman redeemer that was going to wipe out Roman rule and establish God's kingdom on earth. And of course, they found out that wasn't him, and that's why they all turned on him, and he was crucified on Friday of that same week. The polytheist's experience at this time is just as important as the Jewish to understanding Christian origins. Ordinary polytheists, believers in multiple gods, their religious experience was a complete and seamless integration of all the important aspects of their daily lives. Polytheism wasn't some weird, obnoxious, aberrant outlook waiting for Christian enlightenment. Rather, these local and high gods, the powers, the spirits provided a fully functional context for social integration and survival of life's contingencies. And into this mix came neighbors and strangers talking about an approach to the supernatural that totally disrupted polytheists' unified world by insisting that the many powers that are all interwoven into everyday activities were in fact null and void. They were not powerful at all, and that instead only one deity, one God, should be worshipped. And so the message, aggressively preached in a startling new mode of active persuasion by early Christians, repelled many, but attracted a handful, and it kept growing. Men set themselves against other men, some proclaiming eternal punishment for noncompliance, while others threatening violence, physical violence, if the society upending preaching did not stop. And the early Christians had to convince polytheists that Jesus was worth the risk of change. And these two threads, the Jewish traditions and the polytheistic culture, became completely interwoven as Christianity moved outward from its homeland Judea and into the outer Roman Empire. And on one hand, this Jesus sect met with strong resistance, not so much from the Roman government, believe it or not. They weren't entirely against this, despite the feeding Christians to lions that Nero did and things like that. And so the ordinary Jews and the polytheists whose lives were being disrupted created the real resistance that led to the bloodshed on numerous occasions. And some polytheists did embrace the new sect. Such conversations didn't come about on the basis of Christianity's supposedly superior morality or their physical treatments of life's issues, but rather people changed because of magic and miracles. So all that is kind of the information leading up to getting what this is all about. And we've only got a few, 7 or 8 minutes left, something like that in this program. So let's hit this and dig into it. People changed because of magic and miracles. Because these were the central and the virtually only mechanism for convincing ordinary people to give up their ancestral relationships to supernatural powers. And in demonstrating the ability to direct supernatural power, Jesus and the early Christian apostles met polytheism on its own ground by focusing on the ability to help people deal with life's contingencies, and boasted that their way showed itself highly superior. The Jews, too, believed in miracles. They also could be convinced of the new sect's legitimacy, because miracles were a long-accepted proof of Yahweh's power. And, of course, you're also having to note that at this time, the Gnostic mystery religions permeated the entire Mediterranean world. And so the idea of Jesus being the only, one and only God-man that came to earth contradicted these centuries of God-men that came before him in the mystery religions, as we've already talked about for a long time now, like Osiris, Dionysus, Mithras, some of these other gods out there. There were dozens of them. And so to the elite, who gradually gained control of orthodoxy, miracles were a complete embarrassment. They were evidence of everyday religiosity that circumvented their favorite method of discourse, increasingly erudite, increasingly abstract to the common mind, and pagan-influenced explanations of the meaning of the crucifixion and resurrection. But for ordinary people, show me the miracle was the litmus test of supernatural power. Show me the money! Don't just tell me it's so, show me, was what they were screaming for. And so enthusiastic Christians rose to the challenge in wide-ranging and unimaginable ways, and thereby won over the Jews and the polytheists alike. And by the end of the 3rd century, we're talking the late 200s, Christianity had become a movement with an organizational structure, theology, and popular appeal. People kind of dug it at the time. Because of why? Because of the merging of ancient polytheistic magics and practices into Christianity to show that the God of Christianity and the rising notion that Jesus was divine relied on and could be accessed through magic and magical powers and mysticism. Perhaps as many as 10% of urban dwellers and 3% of rural inhabitants believed in some form of Christianity. And in all likelihood, the movement would have continued as one option among many in the polytheistic world, except no better, no worse than others. They appealed to a few, but hardly to all. And so Constantine comes on the scene, Emperor Constantine, who came to the emperor's throne in the late 200s and into the 300s, the 4th century. And Constantine's cross in the sky, you remember, he had a vision of a cross in the sky at the battle. That canceled that trajectory of just a handful of people believing. Instead, Christianity became an empirical religion, the emperor's chosen religion. And remember what Constantine was doing. He said, Christianity, it's like this. There will be one God, one emperor, one religion, one empire. That was his goal. And he used Christianity to politically spread his empire. And it was the horse on which he saddled his empire, Christianity. And its appeal and its spread no longer depended on meeting people's needs through demonstration of power. It was top-down replaced bottom-up. Constantine didn't care about the magics and stuff. He didn't care about what common people needed to answer their questions and their raging problems of life. He mandated it now. So hand in hand with empire, it began its march through history. Christ's triumphant return, the vengeful end of time, always receding before it. And the supernatural power remained at the center, but now in the service of a much greater movement than Jesus of Nazareth could ever have imagined or mustered up in the dust and the heat of far-off armpit Judea of the Roman Empire. Magic and miracles proved his authority. And this is why I believe you see in the accepted Gospels, remember we've said it 100 times, out of the 4 Gospels that appear in the New Testament, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, there were probably 65 to 70 more of them that were written in the same time period. The late 100s to the late 200s, these Gospels were all prepared. Most of them were probably not written by the guys whose names are on them, or they were at the very least, edited throughout the upcoming centuries. But these are the principles. That's not even the right word. This is what the Orthodox elite wanted people to believe. They chose their path, and they diminished this stuff. And now we hardly got into the magics and things. As I said, there were Jesus curses. There were Jesus love spells. Jesus amulets that people wore. You look at even something as accepted within the Catholic Church nowadays, wearing the crucifix on a rosary, wrapping those beads around your hand. What do you think that is? That's ancient mystical magic incorporated into Christianity. And that's all the time we got for tonight. We might have to pick this up again next week before we get into the bigger series again, because I think this is cool stuff to start educating our own minds with. Know what you believe and why you believe it. What you were taught in the Christian church is not what the Christian church was in its earliest centuries. So there you go, folks. We got to get out of here before I run over time. Thanks for coming. I'm going to take a break for the weekend, and I'll see you back here Monday night. Of course, though, watch my YouTube channel over the weekend. We'll come in and we'll do some live stuff over the weekend. We always do. It's Sunday, on Sunday morning at 9 a.m. Central Standard Time. So we'll see you then. Have a good weekend.